Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when and where you are. Welcome to another Festival in a Box 2.0 tasting session. Very happy to report that we have David Miles, old friend of the Whiskey Lounge and whiskey specialist at Edrington Beam Suntory. He's coming on just now to talk to us about the Bowmore 15-year-old. David, how are you doing?
Eddie, hello. I'm doing very well, thank you.
Good stuff.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As you said, it's good morning for me. So I am thoroughly looking forward to having my breakfast dram with you. And what a finer way to start the day.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's the eyebrows and the beard together.
Yes. Put the two of us together and it would be truly terrifying.
David, listen, obviously I've known you for many years and we've worked together on many things, but perhaps some of the viewers don't know your good self. So if you can maybe introduce yourself and what you do at Edrington Beam Suntory, that would be great.
I would love to. So I have now worked for Edrington Beam Suntory, and what was Maxium before that, for just over 15 years now. I started working on the sales side of things, and the honest truth is that while I thoroughly enjoyed that, our sales figures definitely improved when I was no longer on the sales team. And nearly 8 years ago, I moved over to the training team, which is now called our whiskey specialist team. So I have the rather unlikely yet somewhat brilliant job title of senior whiskey specialist. But fundamentally, I am responsible for training on all of our brands, and training bartenders, talking to consumers, working with the big supermarkets, wherever there's a desire and a need for more understanding of whiskey, an introduction to whiskey, people want to know more about it. That's where I step in. I'm part of the training team at Edrington Beam Suntory.
So you are at the front line of whiskey education.
I am. Frontline makes it sound like I am about to go into battle, which very occasionally it is. But, one of the joys of this job is that it's really good fun and people sort of want to, talk about whiskey and find out about whiskey. It'd be a bit ridiculous now to talk about a whiskey renaissance because whiskey has been getting more and more popular for years and years and years. But it does seem to be carrying on and carrying on. So I'm part of I was in the right place at the right time, Eddie. I was very lucky. There's no doubt about it.
Well, I'm sure there's many of us that would say the same, that we've all been quite lucky in our careers. Anyway, let's get down to brass tacks, David. People at home, I'm sure, are getting impatient with their wee bottle of Bowmore 15-year-old. So why don't you introduce the bottling and what we can, what it's all about and what we can expect from it?
Absolutely. Well, just to prove my loyalty, I've pulled out an old whiskey Festival in a Box glass from the last one of these that we did. In fact, I am just pouring a little sample of the 15-year-old here.
Okay.
Now, there's a couple of things that make Bowmore, I think, really interesting as a distillery and what we do with the liquid. We're an Islay whiskey. We are one of the few distilleries in Scotland that still have their own floor maltings. We have the capacity to malt and to peat 25 to 30% of all the barley that we use. But this is an incredibly important 25 to 30%. And the more we find out about it, talking to David Turner, who is our distillery manager at Bowmore, the influence of hand turning the barley, being in absolute control of the malting and the peating process, the use of Islay peat and the different qualities, different flavors that gives us to mainland peat. The floor maltings are an integral part of the Bowmore character of the flavors that we are looking for in Bowmore. And sometimes, like these classic Bowmore flavors and aromas, the sort of the tropical fruit notes, which are almost sort of legendary, they reveal themselves in the older expressions. But what's kind of brilliant about Bowmore, and what I love about working with Bowmore at the moment, is that the quality of the liquid the distillery is producing, that's coming off the stills, the quality of liquid that's coming out of the casks is getting better and better and better. And this is why it's such an exciting distillery to work with. And the 15-year-old that we've got in our glasses here really fits into this idea of being exciting, of doing something slightly differently to get a different flavor profile here. So just having a little nose of this, and if you haven't already, please get your noses into the glasses here, ladies and gentlemen.
Gladly.
You know, we've got that glorious, you know, the smoke's there. It's but there's almost like a cinder toffee, a dark molassy almost sweetness coming through on this.
Yeah. You definitely get the fruitiness though.
Yeah. And you know, there's dry fruits going on, but it's slightly, it's not leading you down the wrong path. That's the wrong metaphor, but it's there's interesting possibilities when you're nosing this. It's like, oh, where does that come from? What is going on here? And Eddie, I'm going to have a sip of whiskey before I continue this little chat.
You do that. I'll join you.
That rich, dark toffee sweetness, getting the wood spice happening on your tongue there, the bits of tannin there. It's all slightly tarry almost in a really good way, but you're getting the fruit, the lightness, the balance coming from those other qualities that this has. You know, there's a lot of people who I've talked to, a lot of people in our company, you know, for whom the Bowmore 15 is an absolute favorite expression. It's and it has this appeal to it. And almost starting at the end of the process rather than the beginning, one of the things that gives the 15-year-old so much of its particular character, the reason it's developed in the way it has, it is a 15-year-old, but we mature the liquid for 12 years in old bourbon barrels, and then everything gets transferred to sherry casks. European oak, Oloroso, sherry casks for a further 3 years of maturation. So I guess technically this counts as a finish, because technically there's no strict definition of a finish. It could be 3 days, it could be 3 years. I think 3 years maturation is probably more than a finish, but it allows those flavors that we associate with sherry casks, with European oak, to really come through and to build on that really solid foundation that 12 years maturation in bourbon barrel gives us. So when you do investigate a little bit deeper, get your nose back in the glass, you know, sort of the vanilla, the lighter, slightly fresher citrus you would associate with the American oak, with the bourbon barrel influence, that's there. But on the top is that more emphasis on that richer, darker sweetness that is the sherry cask contribution to the flavour we're getting here. I mean, I'm thoroughly loving it, drinking it at this time of the day. It's a wonderful after dinner whiskey. I know that just pairing whiskey with chocolate is possibly as big a cliche as pairing whiskey with cheese these days. But having said that, this with some really great dark chocolate is a wonderful, wonderful marriage.
There's no problem with cliches as long as they're delicious, David.
There's a reason we have cliches sometimes, isn't there?
Was a couple of things here. One of which, yeah, as you alluded to earlier, the quality currently coming out, out of the distillery has crept up and up, and I think you'd probably agree that Bowmore is one of those kind of mercurial distilleries where it does kind of go through little peaks and troughs, and it would seem that certain periods of time are, or should we say, purple patches for the distillery, and certainly, Bowmore itself is very synonymous with sherry casks. Amongst all the distilleries on Islay, it's probably the one that most people will have seen, quite a number of sherry cask releases, including the legendary Black Bowmores and the 60s Phenos and things like that. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's 15-year-old has always been a favorite, even back in the day when it used to be called the Darkest. And I think it's a nice way of being able to dip into that purple period where Bowmore were really synonymous with this, pairing with sherry casks. And I think it's absolutely delicious. I think you're right. I think it's an after dinner dram, but actually it's serving quite nicely as a breakfast dram, isn't it?
Indeed. And I did a little filming with Bowmore 15 for an internal company presentation last week, where I was sipping this and eating oysters with it, which is about as far removed from chocolate as you can get, and that worked deliciously. So don't listen to somebody like me talking about put it with chocolate. I don't know what I'm talking about. Eat it with oysters. That was eating with oysters, drink it with oysters. That was an absolutely almost revelatory pairing. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely one of my top tips over the years of going to Islay and visiting the distilleries, but also essentially living on the island for a week or so, is getting hold of the local seafood, shellfish, which is just die for.
It is one of life's huge pleasures, isn't it?
Absolutely. And pairing it with the whiskies from the island, it's just it's bringing a tear to my eye, David. I haven't been able to do that for nearly 2 years. So.
No, I know it is. I am so looking forward to being able to get back to visit distilleries, to get back to Islay, but just around. It's going to be to see you in the flesh again, Eddie. I mean, there's so many little pleasures that are awaiting. It's
absolutely. Well, it will happen sooner rather than later. We all hope.
Indeed. Now, can I talk a little bit just about the peat?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I was going to ask you about quirks in the production process, so perhaps we can put it under that heading. I mean, maybe we interweave it with a little bit of history about the distillery. That would be great.
Yep, absolutely. So, well, all the different things that contribute to that classic Bowmore character that we are so fond of and love so much. The peating influence on Bowmore is really important because we use a combination of peat. So what we do at the distillery ourselves, the 25 to 30% of the barley that we malt and peat, that is peated using Islay peat. So peat, crushed up, rotted down vegetation, but the aromas that come off the smoke when you finally burn it are going to vary according to what that original vegetation was. So Isla peat has a lot of heather in it. It has a lot of almost a seaweed influence there. It has very little wood, because, as you well know, when you visit Isla, there aren't that many trees that grow on Isla. The weather is not conducive to that sort of vegetation growing. Rains too much and the rain doesn't come down because the wind blows at 40 miles an hour, so the rain comes across. Nothing really grows that tall on Isla. So the vegetation from a few thousand years ago that becomes our peat is heather, seaweed. And so if you like, the flavors that, when you have distilleries that use 100% Isla peat, Lefroy, for instance, those really medicinal iodine notes, that's because of Isla peat. Now, we're only using that influence on about a quarter of the barley that we're using. The rest of the barley we use is coming from the mainland. And so that is being peated using peat dug in Aberdeenshire, I believe. And peat from the mainland, you go back a few thousand years, the whole Scottish mainland was covered in the Caledonian forest. So that does have a much more woody quality to it. So our two different peats have different contributions to the flavor. This is overstating it, but it's like we're creating a recipe with the smoke by having the different influences here. And it's this use of different peat to smoke the barley in a slightly different way that helps to give Bowmore a lot of its complexity right at the start of our whiskey making process here. Even to the extent where we actually use a different strain of barley at the distillery compared to what we're buying in. Everything we buy in at the moment is Laureate, and at the distillery we're still using Concerto. And speaking to David Turner, the distillery manager, it's, for some reason, it's slightly easier to get the peatiness into the barley on floor maltings. So where we're turning by hand, it's all laid out on the floor. At the moment, this just works slightly better using Concerto. Now, given the fact that the strains of barley that are available to the whiskey industry will change over time, it'd be really interesting to see what the next development is in this. I would imagine there will be a time in the near future that, say, Concerto will not be available. There will be a time when the whiskey industry moves on from Laureate to the next barley strain. We will do our best and we will maintain that the flavor will stay constant. And what's going to be really fascinating is seeing what the little differences might be because of this. But at the moment, two different styles of peat using two different strains of barley right at the beginning of the whiskey making process do help to give Bowmore a little extra complexity, I feel, right at the beginning of the process here.
Fascinating. But I think, that's always been a quirk of the whiskey making process, is obviously barley strains come and go, and distillers just have to deal with that, or rather, mainly the maltings have to deal with it, but it's the distillers end up having to deal with it, and maybe there's a at first it's maybe a little bit more challenging, but then they work their way around it. And I suppose, as a result, profiles will change ever so slightly over the years. But, that's part of the organic and fascinating nature of the whiskey making process.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that, and I love almost like the balance between striving for consistency to make sure the flavor stays the same, against the idea that, we could do something really interesting here. We could really improve the quality of what we do here. Almost by definition, if you're improving something, you are abandoning the idea of constancy, of consistency, because yeah, you're going to make it better. And we talk a lot in the whiskey industry about this, almost this mythical consistency. It's always going to taste the same because we do things exactly the same. And at the same time, everyone's trying to make things better as well. And it's an interesting balance. There's a small c conservatism sometimes about parts of the whiskey industry. This is how we've always done it, so this is how we're always going to do it. And that respect for tradition, or for the old ways, is absolutely brilliant. But when you get the chance to up the game, you should take it.
So just moving on slightly, David, are there any what obviously Bowmore's a very old distillery, 1779, I think you've already said. So it's historical and iconic. So change doesn't happen quickly, I would imagine. But are there any future plans for the liquid or any particular exciting new bottlings coming up?
Yes. So we launched the first of our timeless expressions just the end of last year, earlier this year. Which was a 27-year-old, which was a quite gorgeous drop of whiskey. And there's going to be some more expressions within this timeless range. And it's going to be this rather glorious paradox of playing up the idea that the liquid will, I'm going to say it will last forever. And obviously it won't. Well, one, because hopefully we'll be drinking it, and two, it will not last forever no matter what. But there is a quality about the liquid that could transport you to any time in the distillery's history. And yet we are doing this with age statement releases there. So the timeless is very dependent on the age, on the time spent in the barrel. But so these timeless releases are very much showing off the best of the casks in the warehouse here. You mentioned the Black Bowmores of legend, let's face it, that the distillery has been producing. These have just the end of last year, were joined by another Black Bowmore release, which was as part of the partnership with Aston Martin. So Bowmore, Aston Martin are now in partnership together. There's a couple of really interesting releases in the near future. Ron Walsh, our whiskey maker, is working with Marek, who's the creative director of Aston Martin. They're putting packaging together, but they're putting whiskey together as well. And it's the influence of of these two masters of their different crafts, just looking what they can create together. And that's going to be some really, really interesting liquid coming out there. And I guess the only other thing I'd like to add to that, much as I'd love it, we're not all going to be able to taste the next timeless edition. We're not all going to be able to drink a Black Bowmore. But
yes, I was about
you were talking about the ups and downs. Last time I talked to David Turner at the distillery, he was raving about two things that he'd just tasted recently. One which was the most recent 25-year-old, and the latest batch of that. He was saying this liquid is just so good. But then he was raving about the 12-year-old, and one of the great advantages of the improvements that are happening is that for all the improvements that have happened in the 21st century, it's the younger expressions where we're going to see the change first. So the Bowmore 12 of 2021, so distilled in 2000 and I can't do the maths in my head at this time of the day, 2009. That's the sort of liquid where you are really, I think, going to notice, wow, this is great quality liquid, because everything is getting that little bit better. We're concentrating that little bit more on making things as good as they possibly can be at the distillery. And it is paying off in these older whiskies, but it's paying off in the younger expressions as well. And this is what's making Bowmore really fascinating and really fun to be part of at the moment. Eddie, you've muted yourself from...
Silly boy. I love Bowmore and I love Aston Martin. Only one of those I can normally afford. So I'm hoping that not all Bowmore bottlings have the price of an Aston Martin.
No, they certainly won't.
Okay, David. I'm gonna leave it there because I think we've come to time. But I wanted to say thank you very much. It's been a fascinating insight into Bowmore and to the 15-year-old. I hope the viewers at home have enjoyed it as much as we have. Obviously, we're going to have you into another session for the Auchentoshan, the Glengarry, so people can enjoy more banter, more eyebrows, and more beards. And, yeah, so thanks very much, David, and I will see you very soon.
Eddie, always a pleasure. Sanj.